12 years ago, Games Workshop released the third iteration of fan-favourite sci-fi dungeon crawler Space Hulk. And apart from a few new missions and fancier tokens, one of the things that really sets the third edition aside from the first two was the exceptional quality of the miniatures inside. Even though both the 1989 and the 1996 editions contain pretty much the same Genestealer sculpts you can buy from Games Workshop today, the Space Marine models were truly something else. The stoic and static Terminators of the 80s and 90s were serviceable as game pieces, but they didn't have much flair. Roll on 2009 and... whoa mama, these weren't your parents' Terminators. The 11 Terminators were arguably the most detailed, dynamic, and character-packed plastic models Games Workshop had made up to that point, and to this day they are still considered by fans to be the best Blood Angel sculpts ever produced. Designed by Alex Hedström, every model is unique and doing something awesome. Whether it's tearing a Genestealer into pieces, ripping up some floor panels, pointing angrily, or having a nice relaxing sit down, each one has their own story to tell. Maybe it was these amazing models, maybe it was the 13-year wait between editions, but the third version of Space Hulk sold out through mail order before it even hit stores. And even though it was given a very limited re-release with a few updates in 2014, it sold out instantly again and became one of the most sought-after GW board games there is. Now, why am I telling you all this in a painting video? Well, a lot of people, myself included, are pretty apprehensive about actually painting these models. They're rare, and they're highly detailed. Maybe you don't feel like you're a good enough painter yet to do them justice, but in this video I'm going to show you how to paint up these fantastic Blood Angels with simple, beginner-friendly techniques, and also show you a few slightly more advanced tricks to add some finer details. I'm Guy, you're watching Midwinter Minis, and that was an uncharacteristically long intro. Just like in all my speed painting videos, I'm going to be using the same selection of 14 basic paints. I'll leave a list of them and good alternatives from different brands in the video description. Because a lot of this painting requires very little accurate brushwork, especially for the armour, it's important that you spend a few minutes on each model making sure as many of the visible mould lines and sprue connection points are scraped or filed away, and this way paint won't catch on them later. Use the back of your hobby knife to gently scrape them off until the surface is flat. You might also want to drill out the gun barrels of the Storm Bolters and Heavy Flamer. I like to make a little pilot hole with the tip of my hobby knife, just to make sure the position is right, and switch out to my pin vise to make the holes a little bit bigger. I don't drill that deep, just a millimeter or so will be fine. The models also have pretty big sprue connection points under their bases, so I run them along a nail file to sand them flat. That way they won't wobble around when you're trying to use them in the game. The bases on these models are pretty awkward, irregular sizes and shapes, and you might find that regular painting handles struggle to actually hold them in place. Fortunately, my cheap and cheerful method of plastic shot glasses and blue tack always works. Now, because these models are covered in tiny, fragile bits and details, I'll be doing as little vigorous dry brushing as I can in this tutorial. Now once they're all attached to my little makeshift painting handles, I'll give them all a quick base coat with matte black spray. Instead of starting out with a red base coat, I'm going to make a slightly more complex red for the armour by building up from black, through a deep brown, to red, and then with bright orange highlights. To achieve this transition, we'll use black, brown, red, and yellow paints, and mix them together as we go. You'll also want a big soft brush for this technique. Not necessarily a flat dry brush though, I'm using this great big size 9 synthetic brush. The first colour we want to create is a desaturated dark brown, kind of like a roasted coffee bean colour. Add black drop by drop to your brown paint until you get the right tone. Thin it nicely with water, and softly brush this all over the models you want to paint. It'll look streaky and see-through if you've thinned it enough, and that's what we're aiming for. Don't worry at all about painting it into the deep recesses. If there's some black hidden away in the deep joints, grills or details, no problem. Give all your models a single coat with this coffee coloured paint, and then give them another thin coat once that's dried. Keeping the paint thin like this will stop any of those lovely details getting obscured from layers of paint. Once they're dry, they should look something like this. Think of this as the shadow layer. For the next colour, we'll mix brown and red together in roughly equal parts to make a nice terracotta colour. Again, thin it well with water, and using our big fat dry brush, paint this all over the armour. We're not trying so hard to achieve good coverage all over the model. The black and dark coffee colours should be visible in some of the deepest recesses. I'm mainly sweeping downwards over the armour panels, and that way you start to get the impression of shadows on the underside of the model. Here's what those two steps look like side by side, slowly building up towards a nice rich red. And now for the next step, we'll just be using our red paint on its own, still thinned with a little water to make it less gloopy and more fluid, and do a thing called overbrushing, which is basically what we've been doing all along, gently brushing over the surfaces with thinned paint, trying not to go into the recesses. This way, we'll make sure all of the main armor panels have a nice coat of red. If the red paint you're using is a little bit more transparent than this Vallejo one, you might want to use 2 coats to create a decent red midtone. Again, here's what you'll end up with after this step, compared to the previous terracotta step. Now let's mix up a fiery orange highlight colour by mixing a drop or 2 of yellow into the red on our palette, until you have something that looks like this. We're not so worried about it being thinned well, because this time we are going to dry brush it. Get some orange on your brush, wipe away nearly all of the paint onto something absorbent like kitchen paper, and then very gently sweep your brush across the raised details and the armour plate edges on all of the models. Always try to go from the top down rather than the bottom up, and that way we'll be adding to the illusion of the shadows underneath and the highlights from above. Once that stage is over, that's the bulk of the armour painting done. Now before we move on to other areas, you might be thinking to yourself, that's the wrong red. It's not Mephiston red, shaded with Agrax Earthshade, layered with Evil Sun Scarlet and highlighted with Wild Rider red. And yeah, you're right, but neither is this, or this, or this, or this, or this, or this. The red of the Blood Angel's armour always seems to be changing. Don't worry too much about it. Now these models are packed with interesting details and bits and bobs. It's quite hard to figure out which is the best order to paint stuff in. Now if you follow along with this order, it should be relatively easy not to accidentally get paint on parts you've already painted, and also quite easy to tidy up should you make any little mistakes. First of all, if you're painting either of the sergeants, use a nice purple accent colour to pick out their robes. For all of these base coating steps, and pretty much for the rest of the video, I'm now using a size 2 brush with a good point. Vallejo's Royal Purple, the colour I'm using here, tends to cover really nicely in just one thin coat. The only thing you have to try to avoid here is the red armour. Any of the other dangly bits, cords and trinkets can get hit with purple here, it doesn't really matter. Next up, we'll use a 50-50 mix of white and grey paint to create a neutral, stony grey, and use this colour to paint the fancy decorations on the pauldrons, the Cloaks Terminators on the left shoulder, and whatever funky design each one has on their right shoulder. These stick out quite far away from the armour itself, so it's quite easy to paint without getting grey on the red armour. Some of the models also have designs on their big power fists, and I painted these with grey too. The easiest thing to paint next is the Purity Seals, the cute little participation awards that Space Marines stick to their armour. Mix khaki and white paint together to create a pretty accurate parchment colour, thin it so it flows nicely, and carefully paint the dangly bits. All of the models have a few of these here and there, but the guy with the heavy flamer has tons of them spread out all over his body, breaking out like an infectious disease. You can also use this colour to paint any skulls that the Terminators have dangling off their chains. On other Space Marine chapters, the waxy part of the Purity Seals are usually red, but because the Blood Angel's armour is red, it would look a bit boring. Instead, let's give them a base coat of green. A few of the models also have ropes or fabric cords, either holding their cloaks on or stringing up their swimming certificates. To give them a regal look that complements the colour palette, I'm going to lighten and desaturate some yellow paint using white. Roughly a 50-50 mix, but yellow paint tends to be a bit more transparent, so you might need less white than you think. Once you've got that pale lemony colour, carefully paint the cords. If you touch any of the armour or any other bits, don't worry too much as we can go back and fix our mistakes soon. Grabbing some black paint now, paint the casings of the storm bolters and the blocky housing about halfway down the heavy flamer. And, to get it ready for the Sparky lightning technique later, the blade of the power sword. Once those few black parts are done, grab your favourite gold paint and hit the Aquila designs on the chest, any embedded emblems on their armour, their dangling trinkets, and you totally don't have to do this, but I also painted all of the little blood drops on their armour, just to make them stand out a little bit more against the red. Now, switching out to gunmetal or a deep silver paint, paint the magazines, the gun barrels, the sights, the chain fist teeth and the power sword handle. And to add a bit of visual interest, I also painted the power cable things that dangle behind their arms. On the faces, I also painted the little muzzle grill things over their mouths, and carefully put a bit of silver into the recesses of their eyes. For the sergeant's cloak, I also painted the blood drops on the tips of the dangly bits silver to complement the purple, maybe a little bit better than gold would. To create a pale flesh tone using our 14 paint set, and so it's distinct from the off-white we used for the parchment, I'm going to mix a drop of white into some of our brown paint. Vallejo Saddle Brown has some nice subtle reds in it, which make a pretty good pale skin tone when you lighten it up. 2 very thin coats on the face will make a nice base coat, and for the hair, I'm just going with plain old white. Again, 2 very thin coats, almost like washes rather than paint layers. Nearly every white paint gets seriously chunky if you treat it like other colours. Once that's taken care of, we're pretty much done with the base coating stage. Now it's time to tidy up. Just take a few minutes on each model, and while all the paints are still wet on your palette, to go around and quickly tidy up any little mistakes that you made. The red-brown mix is good for re-establishing the recesses of armour that you might have accidentally gone into, like I did with silver around the eyes. As always, it's much faster to paint with a bit of speed and confidence, resigning yourself to a stage of tidying up later, rather than trying to be super neat at every stage. Now all of our colours are solid, it's time to add an all-over wash using equal parts black wash, brown wash, and matte medium. The medium thins out the wash without ruining the consistency and coverage, but making the overall effect more subtle and less staining. Mix all 3 together and slop it all over every model. Use your brush to reabsorb the wash that settles on the big armour panels, and that way it'll keep them nice and vibrant, and they won't dry with tide marks. I tend to paint from the top down, and paint each body part entirely before moving on to another part, and that way you end up with fewer sections that you accidentally miss. Helmet, body armour, left arm, left leg, right leg, you get the idea. So that wash stage was the end of an evening's painting, and I let them dry thoroughly overnight. In the morning, I quickly gave the bases a coat of blue mixed with gunmetal to make a nice contrast against the red armour, but you can obviously choose whatever colour suits the rest of your army. I also painted the dismembered gene stealer to match the others from my set, and they're looking pretty good. Hopefully this goes to show that even with just 1 hour per model, you can still get pretty great results on some of the most detailed Space Marine models ever produced. Definitely game ready, and way better than leaving them unpainted for another decade, huh? If you've got another free evening and want to practice some basic highlighting, let me show you a few extra steps that'll add a bit more visual interest to these awesome Terminators. Now that the parchment on the purity seals has been darkened with the wash stage, a really easy step is to mix up your original parchment colour again and sketch on some highlights on the purity seals. Focus on the places where the parchment ripples outwards and paint on the bulging surfaces, avoiding the recesses. You want the original washed colour, the darker shaded areas, and this new brighter highlight each to be visible. Now don't be afraid to paint just a little bit rather than all over the strips. We can also use this to highlight the cranium and around the eye sockets of the dangling skulls, and also to add a few very small dot highlights to the sergeant's brow, the bridge of his nose, and his cheekbones. Take your time on this, make sure the paint is nicely thinned, rest your hands against each other, breathe normally, and use the very tip of your brush to lightly touch the most prominent bits of his face. Bright paint always looks quite stark when you put it on, but once it's dried, it'll dull down quite a lot. While that bone colour is still wet on the palette, I added some green into it to make a quick highlight colour for the green wax bits of the purity seals. Again, just catching the raised edges around the outside, and maybe a little dot in the middle if it's easily reachable. Leave plenty of the original washed green showing though. Mixing grey and white together, but leaning a little bit more on the white this time, will make a highlight colour for the stone decorations on the pauldrons. This step isn't too difficult, but it just takes time. Unfortunately, there's no speed hack to race through this bit, just lightly trace out the raised details, avoiding the recesses. Most of these details are very crisp on the model, so we're basically just colouring within the lines. If you do slip up and accidentally paint into the recesses, we can tidy it up afterwards, don't worry too much about it. Some of the decorations, because of the limitations of plastic casting, have quite soft details. Now don't be afraid to paint the details in if they're missing, like on this sergeant's left shoulder. Now speaking of the sergeant, we'll mix a tiny bit of white into our purple paint and use this to highlight the cape. Using little sketchy downward motions, trace the parts of the cape that ripple outwards. You don't have to apply a lot of highlights, just a few dashes and strokes here and there will really make it look like it's catching light at certain angles. Again, as always, avoid the deep recesses and leave plenty of the mid-tones still showing. That way you'll have 3 distinct tones making the purple look more interesting. So, you've probably noticed that I've left the power sword black up until now, and that's because I want to emulate this energy crackling effect from the box art. I think the first step is to mix up this slightly turquoise electric greeny blue. Well, we're just using 14 paints, but I think we can manage it. Mixing green and blue together in equal parts will give us a reasonable turquoise. Thin it nicely with water so it flows well, and is a little bit transparent too because we'll be adding a few layers here. Paint the base of the blade, up around the little electric element things, and streak it up in a few straight lines along the length of the blade. These lines don't have to be very fine, they'll eventually just look like they're a soft glow. You can also use this colour to edge highlight the blade, tilting your brush to the side and running the body of the brush at about a 45-degree angle along the edge of the blade. When you're doing this kind of more precise highlighting, make sure you don't have too much paint on your brush. Roll it around on your palette to draw out some of the paint until you're getting just a fine line. Once you're happy with the basic streaks, crackle some off at each side, maybe join up a few and intersect them. Try to make it look like arcs of lightning. Pull up a quick image search if you need some inspiration. Now let's add a bit of white to our turquoise and repeat the same steps we just did, but this time making sure the lines are a little bit finer, and in the middle of the turquoise lines we already laid down. This gives the impression that the energy is brighter in the centre and glowing around the outside. Repeat the step over and over, adding more white and drawing finer lines each time, until you're basically just using almost pure but well-thinned white paint to add tiny dots where the energy lines intersect. The final step is to grab some black paint and carefully line the electric nodes on the blade. This will create a nice contrast between the energy and the structural parts of the weapons. And that's it! With just a few extra highlights and details added, these veteran Blood Angel Terminators are ready to take on the Space Hulk and won't just be sitting all sad and unpainted in a box on your shelf. I hope you enjoyed this painting tutorial. If you're new to miniature painting and want to get a better understanding of the basics, how to build and prep your models, how to mix and thin paints, base coating, dry brushing, shading, highlighting, I made a video that covers everything you need to know about painting your first few models. I'll link to that at the end of this video and in the description. If your detail brush is still raring to go, you can obviously take these models further with more advanced techniques, and if you want to take these models to the next level, I'd recommend checking out these Blood Angel tutorials from Barbarian and the man himself, Duncan Rhodes. Again, I'll link these in the video description. Thank you so much for watching, and an even bigger thanks to our awesome team of supporters over on Patreon. Each episode, I like to give a shout out to all the supporters who recently joined, so here's this week's newcomers. Andrew Parsons, Hannes Joseph, Jay Seiler, Frederick Karlberg, Mikhail Grochowski, Rene Planitzer, That Mac Fella, Brett Thornburg, Dominic Giangregorio, Andrew Swan, Lycan, Lady Sketch, Liam Desmond O'Keefe, Chris Amaral, Gino Joffe, Jesper Felborg Olesen, Ranger, Higgsy, Joshua Puti, Doug Evans, BLB Stain, maybe? Dr. Phil, Jack M, Vorpa, Alex Flamand, Cyborg Sea Dog, Tanuki Nuke, Dan, Patrick, Callum McDonald, Lee Clark, William Gray, Fergus, Grimwood, Easies, Cedric Kotzenmacher, Anea Nuri, Jens Andreas, Liznot, Dalton Stewart, Wojciech Morawiecz, Vincent, and Noel. Please hit the like button if you've enjoyed this video and subscribe if you want to see more mini painting videos like this. Next week, I'm going to be combining the world of Warhammer 40k with Judge Dredd, and I hope to see you then. Bye for now.